Chapter 26 The Door of No Return. All four of them pushing together only got the grating to budge slightly. After several frustrating minutes, they sat on the bottom step and listened to the waves crash against the castle walls. The room was so dark that Corinne couldn't see its sides, and she felt the shadows close in on her like the water in the mermaid's memory. Corinne rushed up the stairs and pushed the grating again. It felt like it was pushing back, as if the steel itself wanted her to fail. She began to cry. Drew circled her arms around Corinne's waist and dropped her head on Corinne's shoulders. "Corinne?" Kahiri's voice called out. "Here!" she called back. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Kahiri's head appeared at the top of the stairs where Ma Desley had exited. He ran over to them and knelt above the iron grate. "Are you all right? I saw Ma Desley walking away from the castle with a big, big smile on her face. I have never seen her smile like that." She pulled up on the grating while the rest of them pushed from below, and finally they shoved it all the way open. The four of them scrambled out. "What was that place?" Corinne asked. "They punished people by putting them in the dungeon before they were forced onto slave ships." He pointed at the rooms with the high slit windows toward the back of the courtyard. "Those held the ones who were frightened enough to stay quiet. But you're out now, and you'll be going home soon." "Without the stone," Corinne muttered. "How many stones do we need?" Buki asked, his eyes twinkling. "Buki?" Corinne asked. "Corinne?" Buki answered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the stone. It took up his entire hand, but there it was, shining like a giant drop of water. "How did you do it?" Corinne asked. "Misdirection," Buki said. He tossed the stone into the air. It came down heavy, and his wrist bent under the weight of it. He made a pained face and passed it to his other hand. "While she was trying to fend off Malik, I pulled the stone out of her bag and replaced it with another one." "She'll figure it out," Kahiri said. "Not for a while," Buki said. "She's sure that nothing happened to it. She put it in the bag herself. She's probably not going to check until she gets back home because she won't want anybody else to see it." "Brilliant," Corinne said. "I know," he said. "Hey, you didn't bring any more of those saltfish cakes, did you?" He grinned at Kahiri. Kahiri shook his head. "May I touch it?" Buki handed it to him, and Kahiri turned it in his hands, staring with his mouth hanging open. "It's pretty." "And if it works the way it's supposed to, now you're lucky," Drew said. Kahiri grinned. He led them toward water. "Time for you to go." Malik shook his head and pointed toward the sea. "The mermaids," Drew translated for Kahiri. "You were supposed to find out about their families." "I have the story," Kahiri said, "only I'm not sure if it's really about one of them." Kahiri kept walking toward an open stone doorway that looked out at the sea. The sun had gone down, and the rising moonlight lit his face and the waves in the distance. "Your mermaids, when they were people, would have come through here," he said. "Then they were taken down to the ships. This was the last view they had of home. When you go through these doors, you never return." They stood in the doorway, silent. Corinne thought about what it would have been like to be forced away from her home, from her family, to an unknown destination, knowing she would never return. Her heart ached, and she reached for the stone that hung around her neck, even though her home and her papa waited on the other side of the world, and she knew she would return to them. Buki reached for Malik's fingers and held them tightly. "But they did return," Drew said. "They are home now." Kahiri smiled. "Yes, terrible people stole them away from here, and terrible events brought them back. But after all that time, here they are again." He led them through the door of no return. They climbed down the rickety stairs to the rocky jetty. Corinne put her lips to the salty water and called the mermaids, but they didn't come. "Try again," Buki said. "Cece would have come if she heard us," Corinne said. "Maybe something is wrong." "You have to say Boa and Ma," Buki said. "That's actually correct," said Drew. "Don't look so surprised," Buki said. He narrowed his eyes at her, but smiled. "They promised to come for me," Kahiri said. He and Corinne put their lips to the waves and called the mermaids' true names. Boa and Ma, Ozigbodi, Zifa, and Ababuo. A moment later, the mermaids appeared in the water near them. "Look what we found in a river," Cece said. The mermaids heaped oysters on the rocks. There were masses of them. Buki knelt gently and wiped a grateful tear from his eyes. Then he picked up a stone and cracked the oysters open by knocking them on their thin edges. "You can't!" Kahiri protested. "It's bad luck to eat those." But Buki was already prying them open and passing them around. Corinne, Drew, Malik, and Buki fell on the oysters, slurping them out of the shells as Kahiri looked on with worry in his eyes. "Everything will be ruined," he insisted. Malik pointed at the jewel in Kahiri's hand. "We have all the luck we need," Drew said, taking the opal from him. Malik patted Kahiri sympathetically on the shoulder as he slurped another oyster. Kahiri went to the edge of the rocky jetty and dangled his feet in the water. "What did you find out about our families?" Noe asked. She swam to the rocks and held on just beneath Kahiri's knees. "There was a story about a girl named Boa and Ma, but I don't know if it's you," he said to Cece. She swam close. "Tell us." Ellie and Addie also nestled close to Kahiri against the rocks and listened. Boa and Ma was only 13 when she was stolen in a raid on another village. Her family had traveled, herding their cattle, and she and her youngest brother stayed behind. The brother followed the warriors into the bush, trying to get her back. But he was small and he didn't have any weapons, so he tracked their footprints and their sounds. When they stopped to rest, he stopped too. He slept too long and too hard, and when he woke up again, they had moved on. The boy wandered the forest for a while, listening and looking for the footprints of the warriors. He found a piece of cloth on a thorn that looked like his sister's skirt. He followed it, and he found another piece and another piece. It led him to where the men were, but by then it was too late. He was at the outskirts of the warriors' village, and he could not go inside without being seen. The boy waited for days, eating what little he could find in the bush and drinking from streams he had passed, but he never saw his sister again. He returned home with the pieces of her clothes and gave one each to his mother and father and their sisters and brothers as a memory. Kahiri pulled out a piece of cloth. It was aged and faded, but there was a distinct yellow background with orange lines. "I got this from the man who told me that story," he said. Cece pulled up close. Her uneven tail flipped behind her, dark yellow with red at the tips that looked like frayed cloth. "Was it you?" Ellie asked. "I don't remember," Cece said. "Why don't we remember everything?" Ellie asked. "Why can't we know about our families when we were so close to home?" "I'm sorry," Kahiri said. "If I had more time—" "We will come back," Cece promised. "Miriko Abba." Addie removed 2 of her scales and placed them on Kahiri's ears. "Put your ear to the water and listen." Kahiri did as he was told while Addie whispered into the water. He stood up, beaming. "I heard you," he said. "How often should I listen to the sea?" Addie laughed. "Our songs have a way of rippling on the water. Come any time and you will hear them. We will sing to tell you when we can return." Kahiri looked toward the village with a sad face. "I have to go home," he said. He put his hands in Addie's and they touched their foreheads to each other. "Safe journey. Wone Nyameiko." Kahiri picked his way over the rocks to the beach. He walked away, turning back often to watch them until he disappeared beyond the dunes. Once the oysters had been devoured, the children carefully made their way down the side of the stone jetty to the water. Corinne reached a hand out to Cece, but Cece didn't take it. The mermaids had gathered close together, watching the path Kahiri had taken home. "I can't leave without finding my family," Ellie said. "I'm home now. Why should I go?" "I would want to be home too," Corinne said, "but our friends need us. Besides, Kahiri didn't find your families yet." Ellie began to cry. "But I'm so close to them. I can feel it." She sobbed in the water, making little waves that crashed against the rocks. "We will come back again," Cece said. "Just think. Maybe by the time we return, Kahiri will be able to tell us about the children of our brothers and sisters." Ellie shook her head violently. Her braids launched water that caught the moonlight in fast-moving arcs, Why can they have their families when we can't have ours? Ellie shouted. Why should I leave them behind again? I had no choice before, but I have a choice now. Ellie sped for land. Corinne reached out to grab her as she had grabbed Noe that morning, but Ellie slipped between her fingers and Corinne fell into the water. Her heart pounded as she watched the mermaid beach herself. No, Corinne called out, but Ellie kept moving across the land. Do something, Corinne pleaded with the other mermaids as she swam to Ellie. Noe dashed forward but stopped when the water was at her waist. With every moment, Ellie changed. First her skin turned from dark brown to gray, getting paler by the moment like moth wings. Then the strands of her braids faded to white, of hair in her braids faded to white. Malik dove into the water. He met Corinne on the beach, and they took Ellie's hands and tried to pull her back. Her fingers were brittle as glass, and they cracked in their grip. Malik moved to scoop up the mermaid's body. Corinne followed his lead. They tried to drag her back as her bright scales began to shrivel, becoming as delicate as tissue paper. The line down the middle of her tail darkened and sank inward, separating into two legs. Corinne and Malik tried to move more gently as Ellie's entire body faded to the color of beach sand. The breeze peeled the surface of her skin like petals on the wind. Awabuo, the other three mermaids sobbed. Slower, Malik, Corinne said. We have to be careful. Faster, Buki shouted. He was looking past Corinne and Malik. Ma Desley was running down the sand dunes toward them, with her white dress flapping in the wind, her two sons right behind her. Ellie's body was crumbling in their hands as Ma Desley and her sons were getting closer. Come on, Buki yelled. He grabbed the stone from Drew and dropped it in his pocket, where it bulged against his leg. There's no time. Corinne and Malik looked at each other. They were moving as quickly as they dared, but Ellie was still coming apart. Pieces of her fell to the beach and crumbled into the sand. Malik shook his head and stopped. Brother, Buki yelled. I'm not going without Ellie, Corinne said. We can't leave her. When they reached the water, they placed what remained of Ellie into the waves. The mermaid's body dissolved like sugar, leaving only a few blue and gold scales in their hands. Corinne fell to her knees and gripped them in her palm. Malik pulled Corinne's shirt. Corinne heard the footsteps getting close. Stop! Ma Desley screamed. Anger seared Corinne's heart. You see, she said to the other mermaids, Mama Delo will not let you stay here, and if you don't return to her, you know that there is nowhere in the water to hide. Malik pushed Corinne ahead as the men splashed into the waves behind them. A wave hit Corinne and washed the few glittering remains of Ellie's scales to shore. Malik and Corinne ducked under the water as Drew dove from the jetty. Noe scooped Drew and Malik under each of their arms, as Addie took Buki and Corinne clasped hands with Cece. The men swam into the surf behind them. Cece slapped one of them with her tail. The other one stopped swimming and opened his mouth in surprise. He put his hand to his throat and surfaced, coughing up water. Ma Desley ran into the waves after them, screaming against the breeze. Corinne looked back as Ma Desley's eyes widened at the sight of the mermaids. She picked something out of the water. It sparkled in her hand. She sank to her knees with her hands clasped against her chest and her eyes raised. Ma Desley cried out over the waves, Forgive me.